Anton had often imagined the 12 men leaning as one body into the long, gentle roll that brought the plane into position over the harbor, far above the 7 finger-shaped tributaries of the Otter River. Thus, the unintended hint that might have altered those below whose curiosity compelled them to look up from their morning newspaper, their innocent games. I often imagined their will to abstraction 7 miles overhead, its overwhelming power and its necessity for such an endeavor. Just as his own will to abstraction had been overpowering, living as he had been almost happily on the dry moonscapes of the New Mexico desert. When you are possessed of a driving need to live in the theoretical world, he discovered a desert is just the place, removed entirely from reality so that everything there was imagined, everything but the sun and parched earth. Anything was possible there. If need be, you might even create your own universe. But what had they seen that day? Until then, nothing but blue ocean and more blue ocean, perhaps a trawler trailing its wake of fattened gulls, or just the sun hanging over the horizon. Then the occasional whitecap thrown up by a touch of wind miles below. Would you see signs of yourself, of loved ones and places you missed? What about Farabee, nervously running through the tasks at hand, but in a small corner of his head looking forward to the bottle of Coors that awaited after debriefing, ice cold, so cold it would bring a pleasant ache to the teeth. His pack of Chesterfields sitting beside the ring of condensation on the table, maybe a game of ping pong in the rec room, feet up, mind off. What was so unusual about this? Did they realize what they were getting into? Did they understand the nature of the cabal of murderers they'd signed on with? He'd had his own mental getaways, like picnicking in the Frijole Mountains and the soft imaginings of his young wife. He recognized this need to avoid thinking about it, to think about something else, concentrate on the promise of home. For Farabee, it may have been the red Chevy pickup that had been up on blocks for as long as he could remember, a weeping willow out back with a yellow rope swing tied to its boldest limb. Maybe the easy assurance of a woman, his mother or his first sweetheart, moving silently through a shaded kitchen. All those promises, like Sophie writing letters at the kitchen table back home in Brooklyn, knowing only vaguely where he'd disappeared to and what disappointments lay ahead. Given the haunting realities of the theories they spun down there, she, too, had become merely a theory by then. The theory of ease, of grace, of getting out of here. Anton could only guess what Farabee and the others had been thinking. He hadn't had the stomach to ask, and the day they'd met at the doctor's office in Tokyo. Though he knew who he was, but maybe it was this. Maybe Bombardier Major Thomas Farabee had convinced himself he was flying through the deep blue skies of America. Yet another test, another smooth ride through friendly grids and vectors and latitudes and seconds, unshadowed by the approach of history. Just another test run. There was no other way of getting up enough courage to drop a bomb like that. Absolutely not. He heard a dozen men's electronic transmissions fill the plane's hollow body, heard its shiny hull vibrating with information as surely as if he were up there himself, not standing here in the dark on a summer night at the end of his life. Altitude and wind speed, colorful language, mostly and almost always spoken in the shorthand southern drawl he'd grown familiar with during his time down in New Mexico. He heard those voices spiraling along radio wires into swollen eardrums, ricocheting off helmets and oxygen canisters and shining wristwatches and the glass-faced altimeter. They were in constant communication as they flew headlong into a new age that only a handful of people knew anything about. But Farabee should have been able to guess, his thumb ready, eyes peeled. He could testify to the fact that there was more talking up there than at any family reunion. All preparation and confirmation, check and double check and triple check, because there was no margin for error, no time for a moment's silence, no time to feel the slickness under your thigh or the building pressure on your bladder. Too much information was required if this was to go off smoothly. One false degree either way, and that Chevy would stay up on blocks for eternity. So just get on with it. There was a certain art in being open to the big picture. That's the view Anton had. That's what had kept him going all this time. Maybe those men knew that all along, which was how they'd been able to do what needed to be done. Theoretical, clean of one mind, no single man more culpable than the next, all communicating relevant data to and from the cockpit, and the headset peering over the crosshairs, and each one harboring his own version of Sophie, sitting back at home all the while and waiting for the end of the war, or at least for the next letter. Farabee blinked, concentrating, counting forward. He might already have heard about certain precautions, and he wasn't worried too much about the goggles. He'd been told that the men responsible for the onboard cargo had lathered themselves in coconut-flavored suntan lotion for the first test. Word got around. He heard plenty of things. To the best of his knowledge, those guys were still fine. Most of them had been living in the desert for 12 months or more, soaking up God's rays while in the process of perfecting this thing carried down in the bay. Someone just happened to have a tube of the stuff handy, probably someone who, by the mere fact of his mere presence, was assumed to know what he was doing. At any rate, nobody seemed to think it odd, according to the story, that you'd be putting on something you could buy at a grocery store to protect yourself from the invisible cancers of the new age. Because they did it, and they're all somewhere 10,000 miles away, quite alive, waiting for news or washing dishes with Mozart playing on the radio. He wasn't nervous about the eye damage, no, though he would have slipped the goggles on anyway, if what he was doing didn't require the naked eye, and there might be time once the drop was made. Numbers flashed in his mind. From 30,800 feet, it would take approximately 50 seconds for it to fall, to find zero. He'd done the calculations dozens of times by then, that deep in the flight, as Ball had done before him out in the desert, in anticipation of that splendid final moment. Those 12 men, forever up there in his imagination, worked in perfect synchronous industry to get that plane over its target. He saw the last three with the protective dark glasses still pulled up onto their foreheads, like alpine skiers standing at a canteen between runs. This was work yet to do that required the light of day, strangely enough, after 4 hours of flight in darkness, because they'd been training for this moment for months and nothing was going to stop them, not even now, 50 years on. He knew Tibbets probably could have flown that jalopy in total darkness, and that Besser could have just turned up the shimmer of his radar screen to full. Farabee, though, required the soft touch of the human eye. The success or failure of this great leap forward would be decided in the cord of nerves that ran between the eyeball and the brain of a 24-year-old boy, waiting for the crosshairs of his bomb sight to overlay the T-shaped Aoi Bridge. As for the rest of the crew, he could only imagine them waiting anxiously for the main event to kick in, for the flash of blinding light to streak across their faces, the pounding of the engines and the electronic chatter expanding in the head, vibrations rumbling up through the body of the aircraft, its very walls humming. Part of the protocol, insisted on by the head of the health physics department, who had no idea about the coconut oil, dictated that those dark glasses must separate these men from the history they were about to make. The glasses would help tone down the early morning firestorms somewhat, dimming the realization. They'd been designed to keep the shocking glare from the men's eyes. But what none of them knew yet at 8:11 that morning, really understood at the deepest gut level of certainty, was the meaning of the silhouette their presence cast on the ground below. The heart and lungs of these dozen men were pushed down into their intestines when the plane jumped some 10 feet with a sudden release of the 9,000-pound bomb. Anton saw the man whose face was downturned over the scope like a boy on a roller coaster ride, close his eyes for a split second, wondering why he'd got himself into this. Cramped, his gut sloshed about. He forgot what the attraction had been, holding his bladder for almost an hour now. Where's the fun in this? But when he saw the bomb fall away like a great dinosaur egg, his sense of purpose returned. He knew how powerful this thing was said to be. But he trained himself not to contemplate it. Remember the big picture, he thought. That will to abstraction, win the war. The device wobbled a second, the imagination suspending it in the air. One last hope of ending it right here, a cancellation of plans, the forward momentum of the plane pulling it along as if it were a balloon on a string. Then, the hope breaking, began its rapid descent towards the waking city. Automatically he mouthed, "Bomb away." Even though the sudden lurch of the airplane was unmistakable, the young major said it, because that was part of his job. The aircraft banked a hard 155 degrees right and began a steep dive to get her up to speed so as to torque them out of here, because a B-29 needed more time to clear the area than you need to reach up and snap down your welder's goggles. 50 seconds or so, he thought, meant only 5 miles between it and them, and the concussive shock was going to be out of this world. The plane pulled away from the old man's imagination then, like a cloud scudding across the sky. entered the memory of the girl who had been playing down there on the mud bank of that river, who later, lying in the guest room, could still taste the sickness in her mouth, recalled the instant she felt the push of fire against her body, the sucking for air. She saw Mitsui's smooth, unburned skin, and quickly the poisoned face of her grandfather was branded into her dead brother's back, and she sat up and began scratching violently at her own burning skin. Before full light came that morning, Anton fell into a dream. In his dream, he raised himself on his right arm and cocked his head, and listened to a sound listened to a sound come to him through the half light of his open bedroom window. He waited for the sound to come again, fighting the exhaustion that pushed down on his chest, buckling his elbow and shoulder. He had no idea what time it was, or to what day that time might belong. He could not see the face of the old bedside clock from his position. Somehow it had been moved during the night, or by the dream he was inside. He didn't remember coming in from the garden and changing into his gray and white striped pajamas he wore, loose like flowing veils, and sliding stiffly into bed, looked at the back of the clock, and its exposed levers and windings, and his eyes burned. He scratched the temple with a sharp, curling fingernail and blinked with surprise. The doorbell rang. When he brought his finger away from his temple, he saw a dab of blood, which he cleaned brusquely against his sleeve. In his dream, he pulled away the light sheet and swung himself around and up. His warm feet meeting the cold oak floor, he shuffled to the closet where he donned a tattered robe. Only when he switched on the overhead light did he see the ghostly trail of sweaty footprints left on the floor. He felt as though he'd been wrapped in a damp blanket all night. The bloody cuff of his sleeve, even the material on his chest and back, was heavy and cool with perspiration. The bell rang again, two hollow waves of sound that resonated through the empty house. He followed the stairs back down to the foyer and stood quietly beside the coat rack behind the front door. The floorboards beneath the blue and red mat creaked underfoot as he inched back the curtain to the right of the brass doorknob and saw the police cruiser in the driveway. Its lights out. The car was black, strangely hearse-like. He opened the door and nodded to the lady officer, who was dressed in military gear, gas mask, khakis, boots. Anton Ball? Yes, he said. She handed him a plastic bottle, a size that fit into his palm. You will come with me. Her heavy leather boots filled the quiet between them. The woman's face, what he could see of it, wore an expression of authority and kindness, yet there was also an unease in her manner, in the way she held herself and gestured for him to follow her. It was still early. His judgment was off. Opposite the house, the three powerful oak trees he'd always wished were on his property stood in darkness, undeclared against a charcoal sky. At this early hour, immensely tired, he was aware only of something peculiar here, something unwelcome and beckoning. Come with you, he asked. The room, yes, the officer was saying. She took him by the shoulder, led him upstairs to the bedroom, and turned back the white sheet on the bed. Though the corpse he saw was scarred and burnt, he recognized it as his wife's, where it was not charred black. Along the body's right side, a mass of open red sores and oozing bubbled as if possessed of a life of their own. The woman in the military garb pointed at the plastic bottle in his hand, which he raised in the air above the corpse of his burnt wife, then squeezed slowly and watched the oil dripped over her body. He awoke, frightened. Stock still, he breathed through his mouth. A dampness had accumulated under his body, chilling the sheets and mattress. The room filled with the light of dawn, and through the open window he could hear lake sounds rising up from the bottom of the garden and the rustling of poplar leaves. He waited for a breeze that might lift away the smell of coconuts and burnt flesh that had followed him from sleep. He got out of bed then and stepped across the hall and quietly opened the guest room door. Amika was there, asleep, moved inside and stood over her bed, took the framed picture down from the wall and read the words inscribed in the bottom right corner, Stefano, Pescara, 1927.